This is part 3 of the video series describing the production of some segmented wood eggs. In part 1 of the series we described the design and production of the segmented wood rings and the layers for this project. In part 2 of this video series we described the gluing up the segmented disc layers to produce their tornado pattern segmented disc. In this final part 3 of this video presentation we will describe the final glue up of the segmented disc layers, the turning of the egg on a lathe, and the final finishing of the segmented egg. I begin by first sanding the top and bottom of the glued disc. I sand these surfaces very lightly, just enough to remove the glue on the surface. Next, sand the circumference of the disc to remove the glue and also to round the corners to produce a round segmented disc. Sand the circumference of the larger disc to remove the surface glue and to round the edges of the segments to produce a round segmented disc. Also sand the top and bottom surfaces, again being careful to only remove the surface glue and not to thin these top and bottom layers. So I've mounted a faceplate on my lathe with a sacrificial piece of wood on here, and I'm going to glue this first disc onto here. And to make sure it's centered, I put my chuck on the rotating tailstock, and I'll just put some glue on there and then bring it up against there and glue it in place. To glue this larger board now to the smaller piece, I mounted this larger piece in my cold jaws on a rotating chuck, and I'll put epoxy because I want to glue all my layers with epoxy, and I'll push this in, and then it'll be important to align the pattern so I get to keep the pattern repeating from the top to the bottom. I like to let that set for at least 4 or 5 hours before I glue on the final piece. Okay, I mounted the final piece in my rotating chuck. And once again glue it up, and again matching the patterns. We're ready to get started here, and I have my piece of wood all mounted on my lathe, glued on a faceplate. All my layers are glued with epoxy. I did add a small piece of wood to the end of actually the top of my egg that I'm using to attach this center point, so that I don't drive that center point into my wood, so I don't damage my wood at all. Keep it clean for when I'm going to be cutting it down. What I did do is I marked the high point of my egg. Now the high point is not in the center of this block, it's off to the bottom. This will be the bottom of my egg, and this will be the top. So this is slightly off center, and that will be my high point, as I've shown in my drawing. And then what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using my chisel to always keep that point high, round this down to there, and then round this down to a point on the opposite side, rounding this edge down to this another block, and eventually running that down to the point. Be a multiple step process in which once I get it close, I'll take off the tailstock, round this down to a complete point. After that's done, I'll reverse it. I'll put a vacuum chuck on my lathe, mount this in the vacuum chuck, and finish the bottom. So it's a two-step process in the lathe. By keeping this as my high point and chipping away at this till I get it to the shape I want it. When the top of the egg is nearly finished, I pull back the tailstock and finish shaping the top of the egg. The egg is then sanded while still in the lathe. I start with 180 grit sandpaper and progressively sand down to 400 grit sandpaper. The face plate with the egg attached is transferred to the rotating tailstock adapter. The vacuum chuck is installed and the egg is cut free from the base plate. The egg is then sanded while still in the lathe. I start with 180 grit sandpaper and progressively sand down to 400 grit. This is the resulting segmented egg with more than 60 layers and with a tornado pattern progressing all the way from the very top to the very bottom of the egg. Next, I'm turning the second segmented egg, which incorporates 3 contrasting woods, maple, padauk, and walnut, once again in the tornado pattern. The glue up on the lathe was done the same as in the previous egg. However, the previous egg, I used a round carbide chisel to rough out the egg. On this egg, I'm using a roughing gouge, which seems to remove the wood much quicker. I switch to the carbide pointed tool to shape the top of the egg. When the top of the egg is nearly finished, I pull back the tailstock and finish shaping the top of the egg. The egg is then sanded while still in the lathe. I start with 180 grit sandpaper and progressively sand down to 400 grit sandpaper. I transfer the faceplate with the egg attached to the rotating tailstock adapter. This will assure perfect alignment of the egg as it is engaged with the vacuum chuck. When I put the vacuum on this, I only got 20 inches of mercury. So I assume that we're getting leakage through the pores of the wood. So what I sometimes do is go ahead and put a coat of shellac on this to kind of seal it. And there's our finished egg. I'll give that a couple more coats of some shellac and polyurethane, and that will finish it up. After the eggs were removed from the lathe, they were given 2 coats of shellac and then 3 coats of wipe-on polyurethane. Each of the eggs contains more than 60 layers, with 18 segments per layer. Each layer is 1/100,000th inch thick. The tornado pattern runs all the way from the very top of the eggs to the very bottom, creating this unique pattern. The same techniques demonstrated in this video were also used to produce the other segmented wood eggs in our collection.